Hey y'all, it's Auntie Ashley here, and today is Friendly Neighborhood Therapist Friday over at TCC. So this week our theme was teacher appreciation. Granted, I know full well that not every teacher is a great teacher or even a good teacher, and there are some horrible teachers out there and people who do not need to be teachers at all. But there are more wonderful teachers who put their all into their work, who truly love students, who truly love kids, who truly aspire to educate the next generations of greatness. And I was so blessed and lucky to have a lot of teachers who poured into me and believed in me and impacted me in a major way. So, with that being said, when I was thinking about what I was going to do for today's segment, I was like, honestly, the best thing to do is to name those teachers, to call them out so that just in case they are not aware, they know just how special they are. Now, some of my teachers have passed on, but many of them have not, and many of them actually still work in the education world. So I want to acknowledge them. I want to give them their flowers and just let them know that your work was not in vain and is not in vain. We know teachers deserve better, they deserve more, they deserve better pay. They do a lot, they go above and beyond. A lot of them do. And honestly, if you were to ask most successful people who had an impact in their life, trust me, they are probably going to name one of their teachers from their upbringing. So I just want teachers to know you are valued, you are special, you are very important. And even if you don't feel it all the time, because teachers do get burned out, teachers deal with depression, teachers deal with anxiety, teachers deal with a lot mentally. It's not all in vain. You have impacted at least one student, trust me, and probably tons more. So, with that, I'm going to name a list of my teachers from elementary to high school. And y'all gonna hear this list and y'all gonna be like, that's every teacher she ever had. No, it's not. I didn't like every teacher I ever had, and every teacher I ever had did not impact me in a major way. But a lot of them did. And hopefully, a lot of them see this. Let's get into it. All right. So, just to add before I start listing my teachers, these teachers are also on the list because even after I left their classes, left the school, left and went to college, they literally checked in on me or asked my mother about me when they would see her or still have a relationship with me to this day. I talk to several of them to this day. So, if nothing else, that is like top-notch teacher. Okay, so starting with Maple Avenue from 1990 to 1996. This is my elementary school. Mrs. Farley, that was my principal. Now, sometimes admin and people in those higher positions don't get placed in the teacher role, but a lot of them taught before they got to that position, most of them. And this was a principal who literally, it wasn't just about when you got in trouble. She knew us, she cared. A lot of times, admin doesn't feel like they know all the students because they're not directly teaching you, but Miss Farley, she did. And she just so happened to be really close friends with my great grandmother. So she was like a grandma to me. And as a little black girl growing up in the predominantly black area of my city and always being surrounded by my people, she was the first white woman who I just loved. And I felt she loved me. Next up, Miss Hughes. She was my first and second grade teacher because she followed our class to second grade, which says all the things. Mrs. Santa Lucia, Mrs. Spacone, and Mrs. Robbins. Side note, there will be teachers that I name here that students who I went to school with might look at me and be like, girl, she was mean. Mean, tough teachers are usually the teachers who really do care a lot. And Mrs. Robbins was one. For me, the relationship I had with them, she was special. Now, Gaskill Middle School from 1996 to 1999. First up, my two favorite science teachers ever, my seventh grade science teacher, Mrs. DiCamillo, and my eighth grade science teacher, Mrs. Moradian. These women ignited my love for science and are the reason I wanted to major in biology and go to medical school and become a surgeon. They were just dope, and the things we did in their class was just amazing. Next, Mrs. Accardo. She was a counselor. Miss Fagan, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gormley, another one that a lot of people didn't like, but I loved her. And she used to always say, if you care, I care. If you don't care, I don't care. But she really did care. Mrs. Oblamsky, Mrs. Orfano, Mr. Showers, Mrs. Sorge, Mrs. Wagaman, that was my French teacher. Loved her. Mr. Wachowski. Listen, Mr. Wachowski was the coolest person in the school. literally. And he taught my mama and my aunties. So he taught for a long time and had a lot of people's kids. He was, I don't know anybody who didn't like Mr. Wachowski. He was bomb. Mrs. Jowdy, who literally ignited my love of writing and literature and told me that I would be a best-selling author. Mr. Critelli, Miss Gazy, and Miss Heitch. Then high school, Niagara Falls High from 1999 to 2003. We have Mr. Bongiovanni, who was the coolest health teacher ever. Mrs. Frails, best gospel choir director. She taught all the chorus classes. Nobody like Miss Frails. When I tell you that black woman, she was something else. Mrs. Sharella, loved her. Her English, AP English class was one of my favorite classes. Mrs. Holder, who I believe now her last name is Lucci, but she was our counselor. She was a Delta, and she told all of us black girls that we needed to go to HBCUs and be a part of a sorority and a sisterhood, and I will never forget her. Mr. Lynch, Mrs. Mansour, Mrs. Muldoon, drama teacher. She passed away. But when I tell you she impacted lots of lives, even students that she didn't have. Mrs. Pallone, Mrs. Moore, Mr. Petrus, Mr. Scabilia, Mrs. Tadero, Mrs. Wozniak, Miss Massaro, Mr. Grant, big black man who always yelled at us to get out of his hallway. We loved Mr. Grant though. Mrs. Schreiber, Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Fortin Nosevich, Mrs. McKenzie, Miss Schwank, and Miss Parks. Miss Parks is the reason I learned to love debate. Oh my God, that woman's class. We had so much fun in her class. Last but honestly most important is Mr. DeFrancisco. That was my principal. Now he was my mama and them teacher, but he was my principal. And that man treated me like a daughter and loved me like a daughter and always checks in on me. He was at my wedding, him and his wife. That's how impactful he was. When I got to those teenage years and started acting a fool, he kept me in line. So thank you, Mr. DeFrancisco. Just a quick ad. After I graduated high school, I attended Xavier University of Louisiana, HBCU, and two professors or teachers really stand out for that time. And that is Dr. Boisier. Her biology lab, I had her for bio freshman year, and I believe bio lab. I think I might have had her another year as well, but either way, Dr. Boisier she was the professor who knew my husband and I were gonna be together. Like she knew. Even when we tried to say we weren't dating, she knew. And then so I went to Xavier, which is the only Black Catholic HBCU. I am not Catholic, never have been, but I chose that school because they had a wonderful pre-med program, top pre-med program in the country, just to give them their props. But we had nuns for some of our classes because Catholic schools, so some of the nuns taught. My phys ed credit, I decided to take aerobics with Sister Jean Marie Craig. This little old, she had to be in her 70s, maybe 80s. And I just so happened to be pregnant my senior year when I took her class. And she did not care. Listen, I was going to do that aerobics class, pregnant or not, with her. She could move. And when I got pregnant and she found out, she pulled me in her office and had a talk with me. And she just was, I'll never forget that talk. And I will never forget her. And most people who went to Xavier who had her class will never forget her. All right, that's all my teachers, y'all. I promise you, all of the ones I named had a major impact on me. And like I said, I still talk to some of them to this day. So I want them to know just how special they were to me. Remember to watch the Clinical Cookout. We have a additional episode coming out tomorrow for y'all, Teacher Appreciation Part 2. So join us tomorrow.